A 9-year-old elementary school girl disappeared in her hometown of Sano in Niigata Prefecture, Japan. Despite an intensive search, police found neither the girl nor any clues. In truth, the girl was attacked by a strange man on the day she returned from school. He grabbed her and threw her into the trunk of his car. She was then held captive for years in the house of the man's mother without ever being let out. The girl could not be found, even though the house was just a short walk from the police station. Let's familiarize ourselves with this dark case. Fusako Sano was abducted by a mentally ill man who threatened her with a knife. His name was Nobuyuki Sato, and he was 28 years old at the time. He didn't work and was born into a wealthy Japanese family in 1962. His father worked as a driver for a wealthy man who owned large businesses in Tokyo. He had previously lived with a woman and had 5 children with her before separating and marrying Sato's mother when he was 62 years old. At that time, Sato's mother was 36 years old. Nobuyuki Sato was a late child and perhaps spoiled, never being denied anything by his parent. Once, he even pushed his older mother out of the house because she refused to buy him an expensive record. His father built a large 2-story house in Western style, where he set up a spacious room on the first floor as a nursery for his son. Unfortunately, this cozy room became a hell for another child. When Nobuyuki was still a child and started school, he confessed to his mother that he was very afraid of being in that room and was subsequently admitted to a psychiatric hospital. In addition to other issues, he was diagnosed with mysophobia, fear of germs. This condition made him afraid of touching things or people, constantly worrying about hand cleanliness. Fear of germs led to reduced communication, tension, anxiety, and possible aggression. Nobuyuki's phobia became so intense that he often argued with his father and threatened to reject him if he came home with even a small amount of dirt. At school, he was different from his classmates, as he was too tall and bulky. A height of 175 centimeters was too much for a Japanese person. Nobuyuki often squatted, earning the nickname Kama from his classmates, gradually withdrawing from society and his peers, ignoring girls, and taking out his anger, dissatisfaction, and frustrations on his family. After school, Nobuyuki worked in a car parts factory but often got into trouble due to his character and communication problem. He once urinated publicly and returned home without reaching his shift because he got tangled in a spiderweb. Eventually, he gave up his job entirely and never left his room on the first floor, not even letting his mother in. At the age of 19, a significant incident occurred when Nobuyuki argued with his mother and declared he would leave the house forever. Before leaving, he set the Buddhist altar in the house on fire. The fire became a massive blaze that was difficult to extinguish. Nobuyuki underwent another psychiatric evaluation, revealing severe aggressive compulsive behavior, aggressiveness, and misogyny, which means hatred and rejection of women. After about a month of intensive treatment and observation, he was released. Afterward, he spent most of his time betting on horse races. One day, he told his mother he had decided to become independent and wanted to build more rooms in the house. No one objected, and Nobuyuki started expanding his old nursery with a new room for himself. But then his enthusiasm waned, and the construction remained unfinished. In 1989, Nobuyuki was arrested for the first time. He had previously observed 4 little girls on their way home from school and followed them. The girls were 9 years old and one caught his eye. He rushed at her, grabbed her, and carried her to the parking lot to his car. However, the girl's friends witnessed the incident and called for help from students and a school office worker, who managed to hold Nobuyuki until the police arrived. He was arrested for attempted indecent assault. 2 months later, his father died, likely out of shame for what his son had done. In September of the same year, a trial was held, and Sato was sentenced to 1 year on probation. The court decided that the likelihood of reoffending was low and placed him under his mother's care during probation. Unfortunately, nothing good came of this. During the probation period, Nobuyuki took his mother's car and went for a drive. On November 13, 1990, he drove around the city for a few hours and saw a little girl walking by the road around 5 p.m. was Fusako Sano. Nobuyuki later said the girl was so cute he wanted to keep her. She was alone, with no one around, and the abduction was spontaneous and quick. Nobuyuki parked the car in front of the girl, got out, waved a knife, and approached her. As he neared, he said, "Behave and don't say a word." Fusako was so scared that she couldn't move, allowing Nobuyuki to easily pick her up and throw her into the car's trunk. He drove for a while before stopping by the roadside, where he got out, opened the trunk, eyed the girl's hands with tape, and blindfolded her. He then closed the trunk and drove to his house, arriving around 6:30 p.m. To avoid his mother noticing how he brought his captive into the house, Nobuyuki decided to go through the unfinished annex. He then returned to the house as if nothing unusual had happened. Nobuyuki went to the first floor and entered the old nursery. He removed the girl's blindfold and said, "You don't want to be killed like all the other kidnapped girls, do you? You will never leave this room and will live here forever. You break this promise, I will no longer need you. I will bury you in the mountains or sink you in the sea." From then on, her captivity would last for years. When Fusako didn't return home that evening and night, her mother went to the police, pleading for her daughter's return. A search group of police officers and 200 volunteer school children searched for her and questioned the population about the girl's whereabouts. They searched everywhere, from empty houses to ship containers, and even used helicopters. Volunteers hung 20,000 missing posters, but no clues were ever found. Nobuyuki, who had housed his captive in his mother's home, constantly threatened her, often brandished a knife around her, and stabbed her dozens of times. Initially, Nobuyuki tied the girl so tightly she couldn't move and kept her on the bed. He then knocked her out when she screamed and cried, threatening to kill her if she tried to escape. Later, he began using a taser for discipline. For a year, the girl's limbs were so tightly bound that they lost sensitivity over time, making her unable to move them. When leaving the room, Nobuyuki blindfolded his captive so she couldn't orient herself, or tied her up completely, throwing her on the bed and covering her with a blanket. After about a year or two, he became even more brutal. Fusako often had to bite on the blanket to avoid screaming in pain. Nobuyuki not only beat and tasered her, but also practiced professional wrestling technique. It is reported that during her entire captivity, Nobuyuki hit his captive around 700 times with moderate force and over 300 times with significant force. Fusako was often unable to get up again, and some blows struck her eyes, causing temporary vision loss. Constant pain led her to develop a habit of self-tasering as a coping mechanism, resulting in a dissociative disorder where she detached from her pain sensation. At the beginning of her captivity, she was very scared, but over time, she gave up and accepted her fate. It should be noted that she was an ordinary 9-year-old girl when Nobuyuki abducted her. Another important detail is that the media never mentioned any sexual abuse. Nobuyuki used her as an object for fulfilling refined fantasies, treating her like a talking doll or pet, fed her, washed her, talked about comics or horse races, and forgot about her for a while. Nobuyuki dressed his captive in his shabby clothes and initially fed her 3 times a day with food he either bought or his mother cooked, who lived downstairs. Later, Nobuyuki became suspicious, fearing Fusako might have diabetes due to a large, long-lasting bruise on her leg, likely caused by him. He decided there was too much sugar in his house and began restricting the girl's diet, beating her only once a day. As a result, the girl lost weight from 46 kilograms to 38 kilograms, feeling very weak and spending most of her time lying down. On the first floor of the house, there was no toilet, and Nobuyuki, who was obsessed with cleanliness, gave her a towel and plastic bags, which he then sealed and threw into the hallway. He was ashamed of the hallway and forbade Fusako from going out there if she wanted to. He rarely washed the girl in a bowl. Her nails and hair were unevenly cut by him. Nobuyuki sometimes allowed her to watch TV, listen to the radio, or read. Talked to her, considered her his friend, and even loved her in his own way, as he later said in court. He also gave her everything she needed to develop normally. Soon, she began to follow his orders very well, and he thought he would like to live with her forever. They could talk about horse racing and cars on an equal footing. Nobuyuki genuinely liked her and thought she was a girl his age and could never let her go. The door to the room where the captive lived was never locked, but the girl did not dare to take a single step outside, first because she was too afraid, and then because she lost all willpower and energy to even try. During her entire captivity, she did not communicate with the outside world except through television and radio. She did not develop mentally beyond her 9-year-old self. Later, it was found that her intelligence was very low compared to her peers. Nobuyuki's mother never went to the first floor, but she did not know that someone was living in her son's room. The absence of the mother's fingerprints in Nobuyuki's room confirmed this later. She was very afraid of her son, meaning the elderly woman feared Nobuyuki's outbursts of aggression and tried to work more and spend more time outside the house. When the 65-year-old woman retired, she did not change her habits, wanting to be in the house as little as possible. In 1999, Nobuyuki also began using a taser against his mother. He not only beat her with his fists and feet but also tied her up, only released her to go to the toilet. On January 12, 2000, the woman decided to call the medical center to report her son's madness and get psychological help, but she was only advised to bring her son there. On January 19th, the mother called the center again and requested a visit to her home. Her pleas were heard, and several health workers went to the address. On January 28th, Nobuyuki was at home when he heard that the health workers wanted to take him to the center for a mental health examination, and he resisted. To calm him down, he had to be restrained and sedated. Police were called, and during the commotion, movement was detected under a pile of blankets on the bed. When the blankets were removed, the police and medical staff found a thin, sickly, pale, frightened girl with short, unevenly cut hair. When asked who the girl was, Nobuyuki's mother said, "I don't know," and added that she had never seen her before. The girl was told that Nobuyuki would be traveling for a long time, and she was asked about her intentions. She replied that she would stay here. When asked where her home was, the girl briefly replied, "Maybe here." Nobuyuki Sato was then admitted to a psychiatric clinic, while Fusako was taken to the hospital and persuaded to reveal her identity, find her family. Although the girl said she might not have a home anymore, police were shocked to learn that she was a 9-year-old girl who had been missing for almost a decade. Fusako Sano said she was kidnapped near a school by a man who took her to a house and kept her there. In all the years she spent there, she never once crossed the threshold of her room, and today, after 9 years of captivity, she went outside for the first time. After a medical examination, it was found that Fusako was relatively healthy, although, given the circumstances, very weak and thin due to lack of food and exercise. The girl could hardly walk as her leg muscles were severely atrophied. Additionally, Fusako was severely dehydrated, and due to a complete lack of sunlight, her skin was very pale. Although she had the body of a skinny 19-year-old, she was mentally like a child. She was also diagnosed with a rather severe post-traumatic stress disorder. After the police spoke with Fusako's mother, the girl was finally reunited with her family after nearly 10 years. Her own mother did not initially recognize her daughter, having last seen her at the age of 9. Nobuyuki Sato, who was 37 years old at the time, was immediately admitted to a hospital and classified as mentally unstable on the same day. Within a month, he went from being a suspect to a criminal, and finally, on February 11, 2000, he was officially arrested. His mother was heavily criticized at the time of his arrest, but the elderly woman explained that she knew nothing about what was happening in her son's room. She was forbidden from going upstairs under threat of beatings. Moreover, she had approached the police, who did not want to listen to her, and the medical staff of the maternity clinic was persuaded to come to him at home. This woman did not seem like an accomplice. Fusako also confirmed that she had never seen her kidnapper's mother, although she knew she lived somewhere downstairs. After the girl was rescued, the public condemned the authorities because Nobuyuki had previously tried to kidnap another girl in the same way. He was simply released, and his name mysteriously disappeared from the list of criminals. Sato was never considered a suspect in the girl's disappearance, even though he fit all the parameters and was in the same area. When Fusako Sano was rescued, police chief of the prefecture, named Kojika Fair, did not even appear at the police station to inquire about the case. It turned out he had spent the night in a casino. After this, along with many police errors came to light, Kojika officially resigned on February 26, 2000. Few days later, the trial against Nobuyuki Sato began on May 23, 2000. Prosecutors were careful in this case not to endanger the girl's fragile health. Throughout the trial, Nobuyuki claimed he was not mentally competent, prompting psychiatrists to order several tests to determine if this was indeed the case. They found that Nobuyuki was mentally sound, at least to stand trial. Nobuyuki Sato faced 10 years in prison, the maximum sentence for kidnapping. Ironically, this was not much longer than he had held the girl captive. Prosecutors, like everyone else, believed this sentence was quite lenient and added all possible minor charges to intensify the sentence, even including an accusation of stealing women's underwear from a shop to increase the penalty. When Nobuyuki Sato turned 40, he was sentenced to 14 years in prison for a combination of charges such as kidnapping, false imprisonment, and theft. His defense appealed on January 24, 2002, and the case went to court in Tokyo. It was decided to reduce Nobuyuki's sentence to 11 years. Thus, Nobuyuki received 10 years for kidnapping and 1 more year for the theft charge. He was then transferred to the Tibur prison. It took nearly a year to rehabilitate Fusako Sano, who had spent 9 years and 2 months in her kidnapper's house in fear and torment. Her parents then took her to the countryside, away from prying eyes. The girl still has problems with intelligence, socialization, and communication. She can hardly tolerate sunlight and open spaces, and is afraid of all male strangers. The girl's father remained silent for some time after the sentence was announced, but eventually made a statement months later. He said, "No matter what punishment the perpetrator receives, nothing can change the fact that the family was deprived of their happiness and a normal family life. There is no way to recover the 9 years, 2 months, and 15 days of my daughter's life, during which she could not experience joy or happiness, only fear, pain, and suffering. All of that is now behind us. My daughter is gradually returning to a normal life." And indeed, the girl managed to leave the great nightmare behind and find her place in her new life. She loves to watch soccer games and take photos of flowers. She was also able to get her driver's license and participate in her coming-of-age ceremony when she turned 20. Although nearly 3 years have passed since her rescue, girl continues to be treated by a medical team 2 to 3 times a month. In 2003, while Nobuyuki Sato was in prison, his mother died in a nursing home. His father, who felt a sense of shame, also passed away. Nobuyuki's sentence was increased to 15 years, partly due to public outrage. After serving his entire sentence, Nobuyuki Sato was released in April 2015 and decided to stay in Chiba, the city where his prison was located. He moved into a small apartment and lived mainly on a disability pension, occasionally working a few hours a week. One day, 2 years later, in 2017, it was discovered that Nobuyuki Sato had not shown up for work. The police went to his home and found the man dead in his small apartment in the city of Chiba. He was in his early 50s at the time. An autopsy did not determine the cause of death. Thank you for watching, subscribe to the channel, and take care of yourselves. See you in the next video.
The case we'll be discussing today has practically marked an era in Argentina. Several films and a television series have been made based on this crime story, several books have been written, and hundreds of journalistic works have been published. The main protagonists of this crime story are the members of the so-called Puccio family and their few accomplices. At the head of the organized criminal organization was Arquimes, the head of the family. Arquimes Rafael Puccio was born on September 14, 1929, in General Puccio, a town in the northeastern province of La Pampa in Argentina. He was the eldest of 6 children. He graduated with a degree in economics, specializing in accounting. He then served as vice consul in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and at a young age served on various diplomatic missions in Europe. Later, in 1973, he enrolled at the School of Political Administration and, despite knowing virtually nothing about sports, became Deputy Minister of Sports for the city of Buenos Aires. Among other things, Arquimes is said to have belonged to a so-called intelligence battalion called the 601. This battalion became particularly well known during the Dirty War, and according to available information, its members were involved in the kidnapping and murder of hundreds of people. Arquimes was also a member of an anti-communist alliance and active in the nationalist movement. Most people, however, knew him as a quiet, polite, and inconspicuous man who could often be seen peacefully sweeping the sidewalk in front of his house. His neighbors even considered this activity a kind of obsession for him. Perhaps it was also a way to make sure everything was in order and that no one was watching his house. Arquimes married Epifania Angelis Calbu, a professor of accounting and mathematics, on October 5, 1957. Alejandro was born in Buenos Aires in 1958 and was the couple's first child. Sylvia was born 2 years later and Daniel a year later. Later in 1963, Guillermo was born. Their youngest daughter, Adriana, was born 7 years later. During this time, the couple bought a 2-story house in the affluent suburb of San Isidro near Buenos Aires. The ground floor housed their family business, where they sold water sports and fishing equipment. The family also owned a small bar in a neighboring building, where the family patriarch usually held meetings with his accomplices and discussed the details of future kidnappings. Their meetings looked like a group of friends gathered to discuss the country's politics or the result of the latest soccer match. But in reality, everything was quite different. Arquimes' right-hand man was his eldest son, Alejandro, who was also a fairly well-known professional rugby player for the local club, Atlético San Isidro. It should be noted that Arquimes' other son, Guillermo, was not involved in the family's criminal activities, having moved to Australia some time before the events described. The most important events related to this case occurred almost immediately after the end of the so-called Falklands War, which ended in June 1982. The situation in Argentina was extremely tense and unstable. Due to various circumstances, Arquimes had become unemployed, which meant that he was faced with the problem of supporting his family. It was at this point that he decided to engage in criminal activities, more specifically kidnapping wealthy people for ransom. With the support of his family, the man met with old acquaintances and explained the outlines of his plan. Arquimes' first accomplice was Rodolfo Franco, a 76-year-old retired colonel who had been forced into retirement in 1955 after participating in a military coup. After his release, the man fled from Argentine justice, first to Uruguay and then to Brazil, but returned after several years later. Rodolfo returned to the country. Rodolfo was a truly useful member of the Puccio clan, as he was still able to obtain weapons and had the necessary connections with law enforcement. The second accomplice was 42-year-old Hernando Laberda, a former national intelligence agent, member of the New Argentina movement, and participant in the Peronist resistance. Peronism is a specific political ideology associated with the policies of President Juan Perón. The third man was 44-year-old Roberto Mecca, a mechanic who had landed a job as head of technical maintenance at a local car dealership. Roberto willingly collaborated with the leaders of local gangs who set cars on fire to collect insurance money. The main thing that all of the accomplices had in common was their similar political views and their affiliation with the right wing of the Peronists. However, they now shared another common goal: kidnapping people for ransom. These kidnappings were well thought out and carefully planned. After some time, the name of the first victim emerged. It would be a man named Ricardo Manoukian, a major businessman and owner of a supermarket chain. Manoukian knew Alejandro, Arquime's eldest son. They sometimes went boating together and spent time together. Unfortunately, this acquaintance could not protect the businessman from his kidnapping. The man continued his normal life, unaware that he was being followed daily and that his every move was being recorded, whether on his way to the office, home, or to see his lover. The kidnapping took place on Thursday, July 22, 1982. Ricardo got into his car and drove to a family meeting at one of the city's restaurants. Halfway there, his vehicle was blocked by a Ford Falcon. 3 armed men wearing hoods got out of the car. They were Arquimes, Rodolfo, and Laberda. They quickly opened the car door and dragged him out. Then they tied the man's hands, placed a heavy sack over his head, and took him to the Puccio family's house. At that moment, the kidnapped man's fate was likely sealed. Arquimes dragged Ricardo up a spiral staircase to the second floor and locked him in a previously prepared bathroom that looked more like a torture chamber from a horror movie. The bathroom walls were papered with newspapers, the ceiling covered with plastic sheeting. Yes, this horrific room became Manoukian's home for the next 11 days. The next day, Arquimes called Ricardo's family from a public phone and began negotiations. Meanwhile, the hostage was guarded by Alejandro, Arquimes' eldest son, who knew Ricardo well. The kidnapped man's family demanded proof that Ricardo was still alive. Finally, Arquimes forced the man to write a letter to his family. In this letter, Manoukian asked his family members to strictly follow the kidnapper's instructions and not to tell the police. Among other things, he wrote that he was fine, receiving water and being fed rice and chicken. Arquimes wrote this letter in the restroom of a bar. After making sure the family members had read the letter, the criminal contacted them again and demanded a ransom of $250,000. He also gave Manoukian's family members the address where they would receive further instructions for the exchange. The notes with the instructions were contained in empty beer cans, which in turn had been placed in mailboxes. The mailboxes were located in various carefully selected locations. A few days later, Guillermo Manoukian, Ricardo's brother, followed the instructions and placed a black briefcase containing the money on the steps of San Isidro Cathedral, just a few blocks from the Puccio family home in whose bathroom the captive was. On the same day, the kidnapped man's brother received a call from Arquimes, who told him that he would meet Ricardo the next day. He wanted to release the kidnapped man tomorrow. However, in the morning, the kidnappers disagreed about releasing the kidnapped man, as Alejandro, who had brought the man food, believed Manoukian recognized him. After receiving the requested sum, the criminals decided to change their original plan and eliminate Ricardo by another means. They stunned the man, carried his body out of the bathroom, and placed it in the trunk of a car. They then drove to a secluded location, opened the trunk, and killed the kidnapped man with 3 shots. The perpetrator was Laberda. It is worth noting that there is also another version, according to which each of the accomplices fired a shot to share the blame for the murder. It was a kind of ritual. Afterward, they threw the victim's body on the ground and placed a typewriter next to it, which they had used to write notes with instructions for the victim's family. Several hours later, Manoukian's relatives were still by the phone, waiting for the criminals' call, the final call in which they would learn that Ricardo had been released. Finally, the phone rang, but on the other end of the line was not Arquimes' grim voice, but that of a police officer, announcing that Ricardo's body had been found on the bank of a stream. Thus, within 11 days, the organized crime group had received a ransom and taken a life. Soon, it was the turn of the next kidnapping victim, a 25-year-old man named Eduardo All. Eduardo was an industrial engineer, had recently married, and had just learned that he had become president of his father's metalworking company. The kidnapping took place on May 5, 1983. Like any other day, All left home and headed for work, but unfortunately, he never arrived at his destination. Eduardo's family searched everywhere for him, but there were no leads. It seemed as if the earth had simply swallowed him. Some time after his disappearance, however, the young man's father received a call from Arquimes, who informed him that Eduardo had been kidnapped and asked him to wait for another call with detailed instructions. The kidnapped man himself, meanwhile, was locked in a small closet in the criminal's office. He had been kidnapped in the same way as Manukian. A few hours later, the kidnapper contacted All's father again, demanding $350,000 and some written proof that Eduardo was still alive. These were letters the young man had written. One, however, was addressed to his father, the other to his wife. In the letters, Eduard emphasized that money can come and go, but life can be over forever. After the last call, several days passed without any payment from the kidnapped man's relatives. Arquimes then lowered the ransom demand to $200,000 and then decided to take a break and cut off contact with the All family completely. For a week, Edward's family received no news of him. They couldn't even find out if the young man was still alive. Finally, the kidnapper contacted them again, but this time he addressed Edward's wife directly and lowered the ransom demand to $100,000. It is worth noting that the conversation between Arquimes and All's wife did not go well from the start. The woman insulted the kidnapper with every sentence she uttered, telling him that she would not rest. Presumably, this happened on the fourth day of the kidnapping. The only thing that is certain is that the criminals took All by car to an open field. There, a mason hired by Arquimes dug a well which later became Edward's grave. As a result of this act, relations between the members of the criminal organization began to deteriorate. This was mainly because Arquimes claimed a much larger share of the ransom, believing he did the bulk of the work. Nevertheless, none of the accomplices dared to seriously confront the man. In June 1984, the Puccio clan had another victim. The victim was a young businessman named Emilio Naum, married to Alice and with 2 daughters. According to the new plan, the perpetrators were to stop Emilio's car, drag him out, and stuff him into the trunk. Then, as before, they were to take the victim to Arquimes' house and begin negotiations. But everything went differently than planned. On the morning of the day of the kidnapping, Arquimes drove his car alongside Emilio's car and tried to block his path. The young man suspected trouble, and the next kidnapping attempt seemed to have failed. A commotion ensued and the situation spiraled out of control. Eventually, the perpetrators had to shoot Emilio and flee after wiping away any fingerprints on the victim's car with a rag. The failed kidnapping considerably unsettled the accomplices. Fortunately for them, the police investigation made no progress. Although the crime had occurred in the middle of the street, not a single witness could be found. The authorities repeatedly tested the most outlandish hypotheses. At first, they claimed the dead man was a pimp or a courier of illegal substances. Then they suspected it was some kind of settling of scores, and finally, they even claimed that Emilio had been murdered by his own wife. Alicia, the victim's wife, didn't sit idly by and began her own investigation. She soon found a witness who described the entire situation in considerable detail and even specified what the attackers were wearing. According to the woman, one of the attackers was wearing a poorly ironed gray suit. This man was none other than Arquimes. After some time, Emilio's wife received a threatening phone call from the leader of the crime clan. The man informed her that her late husband owed him a large sum of money, which, with interest, amounted to $350,000. Among other things, the man stated that he would kill her daughters if she refused to pay. The perpetrator didn't want to miss the opportunity to get the money. After all, he had planned the kidnapping for a long time and studied his victim closely. Finally, the frightened woman decided to take a different approach. She called a judge friend, who put her in touch with officers from the extortion and fraud unit of the Argentine Federal Police. After consulting with the authorities, the woman, accompanied by police officers, went to the location specified by the criminals and took the agreed-upon sum of money as bait. However, Arquimes failed to show up for the agreed meeting. Presumably, one of the bribed police officers had warned him of a potential trap. Alicia had no choice but to leave the country. The next day, she traveled to Rio de Janeiro with her daughters. She deliberately told almost no one about her trip. During this time, a housekeeper looked after her home. According to the woman, the phone rang on the day Alicia and her children left. When she answered, she heard Brazilian music. The next victim would be Nelida Bolna, a 58-year-old woman who owned several large car dealerships and a funeral home in Argentina. In addition to financial ambitions, the members of the criminal clan had other motives for killing Nelida. Arquimes and his accomplices believed that the woman and her children were doing business with their ideological enemies, namely a man named Eduardo Massera. Massera was a well-known military and statesman and a member of the military junta that effectively ruled Argentina. On July 23, 1985, the gang kidnapped Nelida on the street, placed a sack over her head, stuffed her into a van, and took her directly to the House of Horrors. The woman was the first inmate of the newly constructed cell in the basement of the Puch family home. Like the bathroom where Ricardo Manoukian was held, the walls were papered with newspapers. The basement contained only a small cot, a fan, and a bale of straw. The kidnappers wanted Nelida to believe she was in a village far outside the city. The basement, the room in which the captive was held, was designed so that it could only be entered from the courtyard of the house. Furthermore, this passage was almost constantly blocked with various objects, such as wine bottles and tools, for camouflage purposes. The next day, Arquimes called the kidnapped woman's sons and demanded a ransom of $500,000. The woman's sons immediately contacted the police. Law enforcement soon installed a call tracing device and tapped the phone. Meanwhile, the days passed. Nelida was starving and still in the same damp room. At one point, one of the kidnappers asked her if she liked rice with chicken. She replied, yes. He then poured a handful of raw rice into her hands, placed a chicken bone on top, and then stepped aside, laughing for a long time. Nelida lost count of the days. She didn't know how long she had been held captive, nor did she know whether it was day or night. Sometimes she thought she was already dead. She only used a bucket toilet, which was emptied once a day. Most of the time, she was pumped full of sleeping pills and given almost nothing to eat. Arquimes, on the other hand, continued to call the children of the kidnapped women and demand ransom, ignoring the fact that investigators were monitoring all conversations. This allowed the police to determine that most of the kidnappers' calls came from phones in the same area. After 32 days, the relatives and the kidnappers finally managed to agree on the ransom amount, the date, and the location of the handover. On August 23, 1985, Arquimes, accompanied by his accomplices, arrived at the agreed-upon location to collect the money. The criminals barely managed to get out of the car and take a few steps before they were surrounded by armed police and ordered to lie down on the ground. As he lay on the ground at gunpoint, Arquimes began to improvise, shouting that his house was filled with dynamite and that if the police entered, there would inevitably be an explosion. However, the man's threats came too late, because at almost the same time, a group of 45 police officers entered his house. During the search of the house, the remaining members of the gang were arrested, including Alejandro, who had just been watching a movie with his girlfriend. Later, the kidnapped woman was found, still in a specially equipped room in the basement. During the search of the Puccio family's home, their neighbors gathered. They could not believe that such gruesome, brutal crimes had been secretly committed in the home of an ordinary, wealthy family. A few hours later, a search of the family patriarch's office yielded 2 submachine guns, a rifle with a telescopic sight, several radios, 4 masks, a book titled Kidnapper's Manual, and a notebook with the names of future victims. This revealed that the clan had planned at least 10 more kidnappings. A cross was already placed next to the name of the next alleged victim, a businessman who worked in the fishing industry. However, the next crime could not be committed because the Puccio clan had been dismantled. At the police station, Alejandro Puccio stated that he knew nothing, and above all, that he had not participated in his father's schemes. He claimed that the perpetrators had tortured him to force him to take responsibility for some of the crimes. Numerous friends of the young man came to his aid and confirmed his statement to the media. They repeatedly stated that Alejandro was perhaps the kindest and most gracious person in the entire state. According to the interviewees, he may indeed have been unaware that various people were being held against their will in his parents' house for an extended period. Arquimes was rather reserved in his comments to the authorities and the press. He simply repeated the same sentence, "I have nothing to say, I have nothing to do with the kidnapping of people." At the same time, media representatives received comments from relatives of the kidnapped victims. Betty, the wife of the murdered Emilio Naum, complained that members of the horrific Puccio family had first taken her husband's life and then extorted money from her, which is why she had to temporarily leave the country. Guillermo Manukian, Ricardo's brother, expressed his conviction that these very individuals, members of the criminal clan, were involved in his brother's kidnapping and brutal murder. The man said that if the criminals were released, one way or another, they would certainly kill someone again. Arquimes' wife, Epifania, and their daughter Yudi were initially arrested but later released due to insufficient evidence against them. Hernando's Loboda, Rodolfo Franco, and Roberto Diaz, who were directly linked to the kidnappings, decided almost immediately to confess and were later sentenced to life imprisonment. A few days after their arrest, authorities led them to the site where Eduardo had been buried. The bricklayer who had built the well, which later became the grave, was also arrested. This man tried to justify his actions by claiming that he had built the well for other purposes. The authorities did not believe him. Later, Fernandez Laborda stated that he regretted not having killed Arquimes. The man said he had his own truth, but that it remained with him. Apart from this statement and his original confession, he said nothing more. In 2020, he suffered a stroke, lost his ability to speak, and died in complete solitude under constant guard. One of the lawyers representing Laborda was Alberto Fernandez, none other than the incumbent president of Argentina. Alejandro Puccio, son and right-hand man of his father Arquimes Puccio, was finally sentenced to life imprisonment in 1985. Alejandro later married a woman who had written him letters in prison for a long time. He died in 2008 at the consequences of pneumonia. Arquimes Puccio was also sentenced to life imprisonment in 1985. During his time in prison, he managed the prison library, learned a new profession, and became a lawyer. In 2008, after 23 years in prison, the man was released early. After his release, he became engaged to his first client, a 48-year-old woman named Rosiala. He died at the age of 84 from the effects of a stroke in the home of a Protestant priest friend in General Picu, without ever confessing to his crimes. Arquimes' body lay in the municipal morgue for a full week, but no one took care of his funeral. The police contacted his niece to arrange the memorial service and subsequent burial, but she firmly refused. The woman took only the deceased's few belongings, including books, magazines, and manuscripts. Arquimes' clothes and cell phone were buried with his body in the cemetery in General Puccio, was buried in a neighborhood that local gravediggers call the place of the forgotten. The graves in this cemetery were all the same, differing only by the inscriptions on the headstones. Essentially, it was one large communal grave. No one came to the funeral of the former leader of the crime clan. When the man called his ex-wife Epifania for the last time, she told him she wished him a quick death. A few days after this call, Arquimes learned that his daughter, Sylvia, had died of cancer. He had also tried to reconcile with her, but she said she wanted to change her cell phone number so he could no longer call her. Arquimes' ex-wife Epifania is currently 91 years old. The woman continues to use the surname Puccio. The Argentine justice system has never been able to prove her involvement in the kidnappings. Adriana, the youngest daughter of Epifania and Arquimes, was 15 years old at the time of the events. It is reasonable to assume that the girl could not have overlooked what was going on in her parents' home. She currently sells boats. Almost nothing is known about Guillermo Puccio. He fled to Australia as soon as he suspected that his father and brother were planning something strange and illegal. According to available information, he did not return to his country until 2020. Daniel Puccio was arrested by Brazilian authorities in September 2019 for using forged documents. In 2015, Argentine director Pablo Trapero made the film El Clan, based on the criminal history of the Puccio family. This film became the most successful film of the year in Argentina. The story of the Puccio clan is another chapter that reflects a dark and violent period in Argentina's history. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves. The current case has caused a great public stir. It has once again raised fundamental questions that the judiciary must confront. Who was the protagonist really? A brutal psychopath who skillfully manipulated people, or an innocent person who was framed by a bloodthirsty thug? A bohemian life often becomes a target. People believe it promises them everything, even immortality. But the story of Sophie is so enigmatic that it becomes clear neither money nor power can protect against a terrible fate, if fate wills it so. Sophie Baun was born on July 28, 1957 in Paris, France. From birth, she grew up in an atmosphere of wealth and luxury in a well-known and respected French family involved in the fashion and film industries. At that time, it was a truly bohemian environment where the crème de la crème of society gathered. Sophie was also a talented, artistic, and assertive woman, which is why she developed in this direction and had a successful career as a film producer. Her face became known throughout the country and a symbol of success. Nevertheless, she did not forget her private life and family happiness. In 1991, Sophie married film producer Daniel Toscan and became Sophie Toscan du Plantier. This encounter was no accident. Both moved in the film world. They were a good match. The couple became the epitome of luxury and wealth of that era. This dream wedding attracted the attention of the media. For both celebrities, it was a logical continuation of their successful careers. Sophie moved into a luxurious villa with her son from her first marriage. In the eyes of all who knew this woman well, she was a strong and energetic woman who defended her convictions emphatically and pursued her goals with tireless perseverance. But only those who knew her better knew that Sophie was a gentle and kind, calm, modest, and loving mother whose life revolved around her son, Pierre-Louis. Sophie maintained the glamorous image of an outstanding and fashion-conscious woman. Her days were filled with constant filming, camera flashes, and the uninterrupted attention of journalists from the television and film industries. As the woman aged, she increasingly longed for privacy, peace, and a family life far away from the constant attention of outsiders and fans. That is why in the early 90s, Sophie returned more and more often to her house in the rural area of Dunmanus West in Cork, Ireland. She had often vacationed here with her family as a child. Cork was a popular spot for wealthy artists and writers who were inspired by the picturesque beauty of the area. The glamour and glitz of Paris had exhausted the woman so much that she chose this quiet, cozy house in seclusion as a retreat. She bought the cottage in 1993. Unlike the villas she was accustomed to, there were even difficulties with some amenities here. The house was very remote, making it quite difficult to get to. The most important thing for Sophie was that this area, since her childhood, was the only place that could guarantee her seclusion and peace. After she managed to get here, the difficulties were not over. As there were problems with the electricity supply and heating in this place, not always, but interruptions did occur. However, this was not so important for relaxation. The restoration of her emotional strength and the search for inspiration were primarily drawn by the landscape and the charm of the province, which evoked memories of a carefree childhood. When Sophie came here for the first time after a long break, she was enchanted by the beauty of nature, as if she had fallen in love with it anew. From that moment on, she could forget all the inconveniences. Sophie preferred to retreat here during the summer months but always returned home. In Paris, the woman described this time as a period of rest for her soul and emotional strength. As a rule, she traveled here alone. This was also the case in December 1996, when 39-year-old Sophie Toscan decided to travel to Ireland to recharge her batteries and read screenplays before the upcoming New Year's holidays. She arrived in the town alone and retreated to her house in a quiet area. The woman was not a recluse at the time. She mostly chatted with neighbors and acquaintances from her distant childhood who lived here. She was seen several times in the town. Sophie knew many locals, chatted informally with everyone, and never tried to elevate herself above others. Because of this, many saw in her not a woman from the Parisian bohemian milieu but the good old Sophie who had grown up among them. She treated everyone kindly and avoided topics related to her work and private life so that rumors would not spread immediately. Before Christmas, a neighbor decided to visit Sophie at her house. On December 23, 1996, around 10 a.m., she set off to chat, discuss plans for the upcoming holidays, and have a cup of tea after lunch if Sophie had time. But instead of a pleasant conversation, she found her acquaintance lying in the dirt outside the house without signs of life. The woman immediately alerted the police and reported that a mutilated body was lying next to Sophie's house. The body was so disfigured that the neighbor was not even sure if it was Sophie Toscan. When the Irish law enforcement authorities arrived at the crime scene, a terrible sight awaited them. The woman's head was crushed beyond recognition, but the victim's identity could be confirmed. She was identified as Sophie Toscan. At the time of the murder, the 39-year-old woman was still wearing her nightgown and boots on her feet. The bedding in the bedroom was ruffled. It looked as if something had woken the woman up in the middle of the night or early morning. That is why she had to go outside and hastily put on her street shoes. Next to the body, the suspected murder weapon was found, a large concrete block covered in blood. Blood traces led to the front door where the keys were still stuck in the lock. 2 wine glasses were found inside the woman's house, standing in a dish rack. Investigators assumed that the attack had taken place outside the house as there were no signs of a struggle inside. Local police officers here very rarely dealt with such horrific crimes. The local police station was very small. There simply were no experienced experts. Therefore, they waited for the arrival of forensic technicians from a larger city. They were supposed to carefully examine the crime scene and the woman's body. The appropriately qualified experts only arrived a day later in this remote area. All the while, Sophie's body lay outdoors. It was raining and cold. She was merely covered with plastic bags, but due to the damp climate, some important evidence was lost. Finally, a comprehensive investigation began. The first thing that stood out were clear signs of a struggle on Sophie's hands. However, due to the elapsed time, it was difficult to determine their nature. Most of the blood had been washed away by the rain. The preserved traces also did not allow for a precise determination of the time of death. The evidence was very scarce. The criminal investigators reconstructed the sequence of events piece by piece. It was obvious that Sophie had died from a blow to the head with a blunt object. Barely visible blood traces were found on the gate and the front door. Unfortunately, most of these were destroyed by the rain. Since Sophie was wearing boots and the blood was mainly found on the street side, it was assumed that the attack had started here. No signs of a struggle could be found inside the house, and 2 wine glasses standing in the dish rack were not accepted as conclusive evidence, as they were already clean and it was unclear when they had been placed there. Possibly the woman had used them alone at different times. Several DNA samples were secured at the crime scene. Unfortunately, the options for testing and matching profiles were very limited in 1996. This important clue did not lead to valuable progress but was kept in the files. Investigators attempted to reconstruct the chronology of events since Sophie Toscan's arrival in Ireland. They found out that she had arrived on December 21. The woman was seen shopping in a grocery store that same day. She seemed to be walking carelessly and looking at the area. The woman spoke with several locals, was friendly, and enjoyed chatting with everyone she knew well. One of the shop owners she had visited that day recalled that Sophie had been followed by a man in a black coat and hat. According to witness statements, the stranger observed the woman and left the store as soon as Sophie had left. It seemed as if he was following her. That was very noticeable. The suspicious man didn't even buy anything. He wasn't interested in the goods at all. Nobody else noticed this man, at least not on December 21. On December 22, the woman set off for a walk on the path to the castle, which was not far away on a rocky outcrop. She walked along the path from which the ruins could be seen, reached the viewpoint, and spent some time there enjoying the beautiful view. On her way back, Sophie went into town and stopped by a local pub where she ordered tea and chatted with some guests who were her neighbors and frequent visitors to the establishment. Finally, the woman returned to her house and did not leave it again. It was only around midnight that she contacted her husband Daniel, who was in Paris. All this information made it possible to narrow down the time frame. The body was found at 10 a.m. the next morning. This means the attack must have occurred between midnight and that time. Given the brutality of the act, it was assumed that the killer should be sought in the woman's closest circle. This is a typical development. In the vast majority of cases, it is a person who knows the victim well. The first suspect was immediately the victim's husband, Daniel Toscan. There were rumors that there had been disagreements in their relationship. As the police delved deeper into the family's secrets, it turned out that the tensions arose because the man had cheated on his wife. This was persistent infidelity. Sophie knew about it and wanted to end the relationship. She had already announced this before the trip to Ireland, as it turned out. Her attempt to escape the hustle and bustle and prepare for the holidays was also a means of relieving tension and relaxing before separating from her husband. Given that they were prominent and very wealthy individuals, the divorce was bound to be complicated and public. Money and power have always been a weighty motive for murder, but Daniel was quickly struck from the list of suspects. The man insisted that he had been in France at the time of Sophie's murder. This was confirmed by dozens of witnesses without any problem, providing him with a watertight alibi. When journalists learned of the tragic death of the famous personality, numerous speculations began, dampening the festive mood of all the inhabitants of this locality. The tranquil small town became a gathering place for sensationalist reporters. This naturally hindered the investigation considerably, unsettled the local population, and could have led investigators astray. There were even more problems because the bloody event had occurred in a small town with too few police personnel, meaning the resources required for the investigation were simply not available. Checking all theories and false statements took a lot of time. Already at this point, the entire local population was checked. Investigators assumed that the killer not only knew Sophie well but also the area. That is why he had managed to go unnoticed. This also explained why no one had raised the alarm, not even the neighbors' dogs. The animals knew the perpetrator's scent all too well, but he managed to move unnoticed. From this moment on, attention focused on a man named Ian Kenneth Bailey. He was born in Manchester in 1957, was a rather versatile person but had a difficult past and a dubious reputation. In his early years, Ian became an independent journalist, ran his own business, and worked in many different places. In 1991, he moved to Ireland. At the time of the murder, Ian lived in a house with his partner and was known for his problems with the local police. Together with a partner, he founded a company in 1991, but then the problems began. Ian Bailey was involved in several disturbing incidents after attacking his business partner. Disagreements with the authorities led to him being convicted of assault and even incarcerated the same year, though only for a short time. Ian was known to local police for his short temper and aggressiveness from previous cases of domestic violence against his partner, which had even led to her hospitalization. However, he was not imprisoned for this. Ian underwent a psychiatric evaluation. Experts found that he suffered from narcissistic personality disorder. He was impulsive and violent. There was suspicion of a whole range of mental disorders. Ian was described as a person with extremely inflated self-esteem and alcohol dependence. All of this became the trigger for spontaneous and uncontrolled outbursts of rage. He himself attributed his behavior to a difficult divorce that had taken place shortly before his move to Cork. Ian also seemed a suitable suspect for other reasons. His house was only a few minutes from the victim's house, which was visible from there, and he could easily sneak up on her unnoticed. At that time, he lived with his girlfriend Jules Thomas. She also lived in this small town. Interestingly, the couple arrived at the crime scene on December 24, almost immediately after the discovery of Sophie's body as one of the first. They knew many details of the crime that they couldn't possibly know. The couple tried to gather additional information from the police, supposedly to write a report. Ian posed as an independent journalist looking for a sensation, but he was not allowed into the crime scene. The police officers emphasized that the couple was very persistent. They even trespassed into the house. When the man was checked and his criminal past became known, it seemed that he was not a reporter, but a criminal who wanted to find out how far the investigation had progressed. Despite the resistance of the authorities, they managed to write several unpleasant reports. This unhealthy persistence in the investigation only reinforced the police's suspicion against him. The articles were full of inappropriate details and speculation about the deceased's private life. Her relatives were shocked by the unscrupulousness and cynicism that permeated every line of the journalist's articles. After these publications appeared, there was a wave of outrage. Sophie Toscan's relatives even officially refuted the independent journalist's claims in a television program. They were convinced that the man deliberately wanted to defame the name of the murdered woman to become famous and earn money from it. They shared the opinion of law enforcement regarding his possible involvement and viewed him with suspicion. When the police questioned him, he denied having known the deceased at all. However, this version was not shared by everyone. People from Sophie's immediate circle who lived here and had known her since childhood were convinced that they knew each other and considered him involved in the crime. The media also contributed to this by willingly taking up the idea of the journalist's involvement in the murder. He himself denied any guilt and referred to his notes and an informant who, according to him, had provided him with valuable information about the crime. However, he refused to reveal his name. The main character in the man's articles was not only Sophie Toscan, but also a criminal from her inner circle who had allegedly hired the killer. He was convinced that it was one of the woman's former lovers or even her husband, with whom a divorce was imminent. While dealing with the refutations of these lies, a truly valuable anonymous statement emerged. A resident reported seeing an unknown man near the deceased's house around 3 a.m. on December 23. The description matched the man the local shop owner had seen in his store, the man who had been following Sophie. Interestingly, this anonymous witness gave a more detailed description that exactly matched Ian's appearance. A few days later, the independent scandal reporter was arrested and taken to the police station for questioning. There he behaved very nervously, made a scene, and threatened to deal with the arbitrariness. Investigators immediately noticed suspicious scratches on the man's face and hands. He explained that a Christmas tree had fallen on him while he was cutting it in the forest. The police officers doubted this version and took photos of the scratches, which made him even angrier. The man's behavior seemed overly aggressive, but he attributed it to his psychological problems. The suspect continued to deny knowing Sophie Toscan and insisted on his version. He believed that one of her ex-boyfriends might have hired a killer to kill her. The suspect loudly claimed that Daniel Toscan, not he, should be interrogated. However, the authorities were convinced that the perpetrator was a local resident who knew the town well. This explained how he could get to Sophie's house without leaving any traces. Ian rightly pointed out that the criminal investigators had taken too long to get to the crime scene, so the traces had simply been washed away by the rain, and affiliation with the town had nothing to do with it. He described the initial investigation of the crime scene as negligence and accused the police of wanting to make him a scapegoat. Investigators spoke with Ian's acquaintances who reported seeing him in a local pub the evening before the crime. His face had no scratches. It seemed unlikely that the man had gone into the forest at night to cut down a Christmas tree after visiting the pub. Despite his protests, the main suspect was arrested on February 10, 1997. This was achieved thanks to new information. The area around Sophie's house and the house itself were examined more closely, but nothing was found. Instead, another important witness emerged, Jules Thomas. The woman was brought in for questioning after the New Year's holidays. She was very afraid of the accusations the police might make against her, and this fear made her talk. She confessed that she had actually met Sophie in the store on December 21. Ian had learned of the celebrity's arrival and gone looking for her to get a sensational story. Furthermore, Julie believed that he might have followed Sophie to the viewpoint she had gone to on the 22nd to admire the castle. He had also been there. When Ian returned that day, he behaved secretively and strangely and even made a disturbing remark that something frightening might happen in the town that night. Ian never said what he meant by that. On the evening of the same day, the two went for a walk, but when they returned, Ian went out again and, as he later admitted, only returned an hour later. He thought Julie was already asleep, but in fact she woke up several times during the night and did not find her lover at home. The journalist later admitted that he had gone to his studio, which was nearby at that time, and had worked there until 9 a.m. The contradictions in his statements, as well as Julie's statements, led to the man's arrest. However, within 12 hours, no concrete evidence was found linking the main suspect to the murder. Under Irish law, a suspect must be released if no irrefutable evidence of their guilt is presented within 12 hours of their arrest. Ian was interrogated. A confession was the only way to put him behind bars in this situation, but he remained unyielding. Law enforcement was forced to release him. However, suspicion against the man intensified. Bailey's behavior became increasingly erratic. He attributed this to psychological problems. Against the backdrop of his involvement in this story as an alleged murderer, the man's health deteriorated. He even began describing hallucinations and at the same time tried to accuse the police of defamation, but all this was in vain. The suspect continued to spread rumors that now sounded like delusions. It was only on January 27, 1998 that it was decided to arrest him again. Ian again pleaded his innocence and claimed the police could not have anything against him. Investigators referred to the only evidence: DNA traces found at the crime scene that did not match the victim. However, these were of poor quality. As the body had lain outdoors for a long time, they were heavily contaminated. It failed again to link him unequivocally to the murder. This became a major problem. Under Irish law, a person can only be arrested twice without charge for a crime. Ian continued to insist on his innocence. The authorities had only hours left during his second detention to prove his involvement in the murder. The man was put under pressure, hoping to force a confession, but he only became angrier and tried to use his connections in journalistic circles to portray the police of the Irish small town in a bad light. The independent journalist again accused the authorities of wanting to make him a scapegoat. Investigators remained convinced that he knew the law and was stalling for time. Although many believed in Ian's guilt, he attributed his unhealthy interest to his journalistic activities, saying he was only trying to get a sensational story. This explained why he had observed Sophie while she was still alive wherever she went. The police again could not find anything against Ian. The main suspect was released, and the investigation finally came to a standstill. In 2003, the man sued several news agencies for defamation. His possible involvement in the murder was never refuted. The man provoked a lawsuit against the media to clear his name. In this trial, several people testified against him, admitting to having seen him on the day of Sophie's death and also before. Most questions were directed at an anonymous witness who had seen Ian Bailey near Sophie's house at night. He accused him of making a false statement. Jules Thomas testified for the prosecution, describing him as a coarse and unstable person. In her opinion, the former lover was indeed capable of something cruel and bloody. Despite all this, the Irish authorities insisted that there were no charges against him. No irrefutable evidence was found, and the collected DNA samples could not be fully analyzed to this day. Ian was bound by the law. Sophie Toscan's family was shocked by the lack of results. The relatives and even the victim's husband considered the police's behavior incompetent. In 2008, the deceased's family turned to a French court, asking for an investigation into the woman's death to be initiated within its jurisdiction. But here, too, there were problems. The main witness in this case admitted to falsely accusing the journalist Ian Bailey out of fear of the police. When the main suspect learned of this, he went one step further. In November 2014, he decided to sue the Irish state for wrongful prosecution. His lawyer built his tactic on the confession of the main witness. Despite all this, a French court began proceedings without the presence of Ian Bailey. Under French law, a court can convene in France if a French citizen is killed abroad. About 30 witnesses were called. After the trial concluded, the man was found guilty of murder in absentia of the accused and sentenced to 25 years in prison. The Supreme Court of Ireland refused his extradition, again citing the unlawful decision of the court due to insufficient evidence against the man. The convict, sentenced under French law, remained in Ireland and evaded any extradition threat. A new breakthrough in this case occurred in 2022, when the Irish and French judiciaries decided to join forces and find out who might have killed Sophie Toscan. They retrieved all the files and began to analyze all the evidence again. Some of it was lost, others damaged. Speculations arose that an accomplice of Daniel Toscan might have been involved in the crime. Ian's story might have been close to the truth, however, he did not live to see how the story ended. In January 2024, Ian Bailey died of cardiac arrest. The police came to his apartment to obtain material for a DNA match with the evidence from the 1990s investigation. With today's technologies, DNA profiling and the analysis of biological materials offered a real chance to find out what had happened. Nearly 30 years had passed since the woman's death. Finally, there was hope that they could find out who killed Sophie, but there are still no answers. Thank you for watching. Please like and comment. Take care of yourselves.
Serial killer. When this word appears in the local news, panic breaks out. Women are afraid to go to work, and parents no longer let their children onto the street. The number of serial crimes is decreasing year by year. More cameras are being installed on the streets. Dark corners of the cities are illuminated with lanterns. However, this was not always the case. Today, we tell you about the mysterious Danilovsky serial killer, who has been cruelly murdering girls and women since 1992. The serial killer used homemade snares and skillfully covered his tracks, thereby terrifying the inhabitants of the city. For help in catching the Danilovsky maniac, the authorities promised a reward of 1 million rubles, and investigators checked 14,000 city residents for their involvement in the murders. So let's find out together who this maniac is, who terrified not only the entire city, but also the entire police force. And why couldn't he be caught for 33 years? He acted so boldly, as if he wasn't afraid of being seen. The Danilovsky serial killer committed his first attack before he was exposed in February 2004. 17-year-old Marina Ostovskaya from Cherepovets in the Vologda region wanted to visit her family, whose son was serving in the army, and often wrote her letters, which he sent through his parents. When Marina left work around 2 p.m. for lunch break, she decided not to waste time and take a shortcut. From the building on Sovetsky Prospect, she walked across a wasteland to Danilov Street. The murderer was later named after this street. The young woman seemed to have no cause for alarm. It was light, and she was walking. But Ostrovskaya never reached her destination. Her parents raised the alarm when she didn't come home in the evening. The Ostrovskayas contacted the police, but they failed to find Marina while the trail was hot. The young woman seemed to have vanished into thin air. In August 2004, while the search for Marina was still underway, terrible news shook the city. The body of 19-year-old student Irina Popova was found on a wasteland in Petinsky. She had been abused and strangled. At the beginning of September, 22-year-old Tatiana Bayeva was killed in the same manner. A maniac attacked his victim behind a local art school as Bayeva was returning home from a disco. 3 months later, on December 8th, the body of 17-year-old Tatiana Maximova was found on a wasteland near the military commandant's office on Sovetsky Prospect. She too had been abused and strangled. The killer hid the victim under branches and leaves and covered her with snow. The Danilovsky maniac committed his next attack on June 26, 2005. At that time, 31-year-old Ludmila Miroshnichenko disappeared. A woman who lived in a house on Babushkina Street and had arranged to meet a friend at Park Lane at 1 p.m. that day, but did not appear for the meeting. As in the Ostrovskaya case, Miroshnichenko was not found immediately either. Both victims were discovered after another brutal attack. On July 14, 2005, Svetlana Stepanova was on her way to the beach of the Sheksna River with her sister and a friend. As the group crossed a wasteland, the girl noticed that the strap of her sandal had come undone. She stopped to fasten it. Her companions did not wait for Svetlana and walked a little further. When they turned around, a terrible sight met their eyes. An unknown person was dragging her into the bushes. The youths screamed. The frightened monster killed the girl, left the body, and fled through the courtyard of a correctional facility. When they ran to the bushes, Svetlana's friend and sister saw her bag containing a swimsuit and towel lying on the street. Stepanova herself lay half naked and with her throat slit, slightly away in the bushes. The arriving investigators began searching the area and came upon an abandoned district police building. Construction work had stopped at the foundation level. However, the construction workers had already set up an underground garage. There, the bodies of Marina Ostrovskaya and Lyudmila Miroshnichenko were found. The killer had thrown them into a concrete pit and covered them with car tires. During the examination of the garage, investigators noticed strange drawings on the walls. In all likelihood, they came from the Danilovsky maniac. The militia brought the friend and sister of the murdered Svetlana Stepanova to the police. Investigators hoped that the witnesses could describe the maniac's appearance. But they couldn't properly recall the attacker's face and were of no help to the investigators. Meanwhile, forensic experts determined that Ostrovskaya and Miroshnichenko had been abused and strangled. The killer had killed them with a homemade noose. A genetic examination confirmed that both victims had been killed by one and the same man. Investigators suspected that the Danilovsky maniac lived near the wasteland where he committed his attacks. Investigators checked several dozen men living on Danilov Street. Handwriting samples and blood samples for DNA analysis were taken from all suspects. In total, 14,000 residents of Cherepovets were checked for their involvement in the murders during the investigation. Several people were even arrested after the checks, but the Danilovsky maniac was not among them. Investigators did not rule out that the serial killer might have moved elsewhere after finding out he was being sought. It was also suggested that the monster might have resorted to a trick and intentionally gotten himself locked up for minor offenses so as not to fall under suspicion. It seemed as if the investigators were on the verge of the truth. The killer disappeared for 2 long years, and the residents of Cherepovets breathed a sigh of relief. But in the summer of 2007, the Danilovsky maniac went hunting again. On June 11th, 17-year-old schoolgirl Natalia Zakhalova walked through a strip of woods near the Oktobersky Bridge. The girl was on her way to the pier of a ski resort on the bank of the Sheksna River, a popular recreation spot for anglers and locals. It was only a few minutes until the pier when Natalia called her parents, who were waiting for her on the bank, and said she would be there soon. But time passed, and the girl did not show up. The worried parents, the Zakhalovs, tried to call their daughter, but her phone was switched off. They rushed to the police, and several patrol cars immediately drove to the crime scene. The officers took their batons, lined up shoulder to shoulder, and combed the forest. Strips. After 15 minutes, they found the girl's body. She had been abused and killed. As it turned out, Natalia had only 10 more meters to go to the bank when she was attacked by the man. After questioning potential witnesses, investigators found a man who claimed to have seen a strange man in dirty clothes and wearing glasses near the spot where the schoolgirl's body was found. The perpetrator was between 30 and 50 years old. He was approximately tall and had a strong build. He had short-cut hair in the neck area. He had small bald patches or individual gray hairs. A description for the wanted person was circulated throughout Russia. One of the most striking features the witness described about the man was his cloudy gaze. Questioning the students and teachers of the special school located near the abandoned building of the Regional Police Directorate also yielded results. As it turned out, they had encountered a strange man who was painting on the walls of the school. These witnesses also noticed that the stranger had a very strange look, which is why the murderer in Cherepovets was called the Cloudy-Eyed Killer. However, the police did not rule out that the suspicious man seen at the crime scene was an ordinary marginalized person searching for empty bottles in the woods. Be that as it may, based on the witness statements, the police created a composite sketch of the suspect. Almost the entire city was plastered with flyers, but it did not help. The reward offered by the city administration for clues leading to the apprehension of the Danilovsky killer was also unsuccessful. Initially, the authorities were prepared to pay 500,000 rubles. Later, the amount was increased to 1 million. However, this step only complicated the investigation further. The police were overwhelmed with calls and messages from citizens who desperately wanted the money, but had no valuable information. Meanwhile, the former head of the criminal police of Cherepovets was of the opinion that it could be a transient who had already left the city. The officers had his DNA. A wanted notice was sent throughout Russia, but there was no indication that the perpetrator had surfaced anywhere. Although intensive work was carried out to solve these crimes, there was information about the approximate age of the murderer and some other operational leads, but without results. By 2008, the case file of the Danilov serial killer comprised volumes. The murderer even made his strangling snares himself because he feared being identified through his purchases of straps, leashes, and similar items. Investigators did not rule out that this caution on the part of the killer was due to his previous work with law enforcement agencies. Such cases are always difficult to solve because the perpetrator plans everything in advance and usually leaves no trace. Furthermore, one must not forget that these are often people with psychological disorders who think unconventionally. In July 2008, a mentally disturbed resident of Cherepovets fell into the hands of the police. Near Solyanoy Park, he suddenly attacked two girls and tried to drag them into the bushes. The two screamed for help. Witnesses called the police, and the attacker was arrested. The police immediately suspected that he was the Danilovsky killer. But a genetic examination showed that the arrested person had nothing to do with the series of murders in Cherepovets. A year later, a new suspect appeared to the police who resembled the composite sketch of the Danilovsky killer. This was a 70-year-old resident of Veliki Ustyug who lived with his 54-year-old girlfriend in the Dacha Cooperative u Medvedya in the Vologda district. The similarity to the composite sketch was partly due to the fact that the pensioner looked significantly younger than he was. Investigators became aware of him when the older man killed and was arrested for killing his girlfriend, with whom he had been for 10 years, in a fit of jealousy after another argument. At that time, it turned out that due to his work, he had regularly been in Cherepovets between 2004 and 2007, the period during which the series of murders was committed. The man's blood type matched the samples found on the victims' bodies, and investigators grew more certain every day that he was the Danilovsky serial killer. However, a genetic examination revealed that the investigators were mistaken. Ultimately, the arrested man was only convicted for the murder of his partner. Time passed, and terrible rumors spread throughout the city. November 2011 was overshadowed for the residents of Cherepovets by the disappearance of the 20-year-old student Svetlana Filiuk. On the day of her disappearance, the young woman had argued with her boyfriend and had gone for a walk, feeling sad about it. In the evening, Svetlana called her friend twice and said she was on Butushkova Street. He promised to come to her, but when he arrived there, Svetlana had already disappeared and did not return home. The search for Filiuk began the next day. Divers searched the bottom of the nearest river, and volunteers combed the strip of woods, hoping to find her alive. But no one found traces of Svetlana. Soon, witnesses were found who had seen the missing woman on the Oktyabrski Bridge. She was sitting on the guardrail and smoking. Besides the possibility of a violent death, various other theories were investigated. It was not ruled out that Svetlana had voluntarily ended her life or had been the victim of an accident. Meanwhile, rumors spread in Cherepovets that she had fallen victim to the Danilovsky serial killer, who was hunting again. It was rumored in the city that investigators had allegedly found the bodies of other young women from Cherepovets. The militia tried to calm the citizens and refute these terrible rumors. Only a single unidentified body was found near the first cemetery. Svetlana Filiuk's remains were only found in the summer of 2012. Initially, volunteers combed the area around Oktyabrski again and found her jeans and boots. However, the searchers did not immediately realize that the items belonged to the missing woman from Cherepovets. Shortly afterward, the volunteers came upon a shallow pit containing a body covered with aspen branches. Obviously, the perpetrator used the dense bushes growing along Oktyabrski. He dragged the young woman there, abused her, and strangled her. After the discovery of the body, the city authorities ordered the bushes along the entire Oktyabrski area to be cut down. However, Svetlana Filiuk was never officially counted among the victims of the Danilovsky serial killer. A genetic examination confirmed no match between the DNA samples found on the bodies of the serial killer's victims and those of Svetlana. Nevertheless, the modus operandi of her killer was strikingly similar to that of the wanted serial killer. Furthermore, Svetlana was last seen near the location where the seventh victim, Natalia Zakalova, was murdered in 2007. Therefore, residents had no doubt that Filiuk had also been killed by the Danilovsky serial killer. In the meantime, the city authorities decided to demolish the unfinished building of the district police office, where the serial killer had buried his victims. Although approximately 20 theories were tested, 1,200 people were questioned, and about 180 expert reports were prepared during the investigation. Law enforcement agencies have still not succeeded in tracking down the killer. However, it turned out that the Danilovsky killer had committed his first murder back in 1992. At that time, residents of a house in Cherepovets found the body of a young woman with several stab wounds, including one to the heart, in a stairwell. The woman had spent the evening with friends. They drove her home, ensured she reached her building entrance, and drove away, one of the witnesses reported. It later turned out that she had not gone to her apartment, but to another house, where she was later found. She was killed precisely in that entrance, even though she had no connection to that location. At the time, extensive investigations remained fruitless. Now the case has been reopened, and investigations are being carried out. The case was only added to the general investigation after matching biological traces were found. Investigators do not rule out that this is not the first victim, because in the 90s, DNA testing was not yet conducted, only biological testing. The next crime, which was previously not attributed to the Danilovsky serial killer, was committed in 1993 on Believa Street. A 17-year-old woman was on her way home from a visit. She lived nearby, just 3 to 4 minutes walk away, but she did not arrive home, and towards morning, passers-by found her body with traces of strangulation and abuse. At the time, there was no indication that these cases were linked. The crimes were committed in different parts of the city and differed in modus operandi. However, an investigation conducted in 2022 revealed that the DNA of the Danilovsky serial killer was found on the tools used in the 1993 crime. The series of murders continued between 1999 and 2003. 6 more women were killed. Different suspects were convicted for some of the murders, but now the investigative authority is convinced that all these victims also fall under the serial killer's count. One of the suspects in the Danilovsky serial killer case was the serial killer Maxim Nikolaevich Krenov from Ivanovo, who had committed 14 murders between 2010 and 2014 and was arrested in Cherepovets in 2019. The first murder was committed in 2010 in the village of Bunkovo. 9 months later, another victim was found near the Ivanovo-Pskovskoy highway. Shortly afterward, the bodies of 2 women were found near the settlement of Zelenodorozhny. All victims were robbed and abused. At that time, the traces strongly resembled those of the Danilovsky serial killer. Investigators assumed that the perpetrator was traveling in a car manufactured in Russia. At the time, the governor offered a reward of 500,000 rubles for information that could lead to the solution of the crimes. Another 500,000 rubles were allocated from the budget for the investigation. Thousands of genetic tests were carried out. Unfortunately, the biological material was damaged due to a major error, and it was only years later that investigators managed to find a suspect who was already in Cherepovets at that time. Maxim confessed to the crimes and showed where and how he had committed them. He worked as a painter, was unmarried, and had 2 minor children. Surprisingly, he retracted his confession in court. The trial was held behind closed doors due to the articles regarding abuse. The aggrieved Galina, who lost her 20-year-old daughter at the time, recounts that the defendant refused to apologize to the relatives of the deceased. First, he confessed, But then he retracted his statement in court. He said he had been treated badly, the poor man. He has children. He worried about his children. But not a hair was harmed on his children, nor on him. And they remain, with their mother. Maxime already had previous convictions for robbery, theft, and assault, but was granted early parole. The current verdict is the maximum penalty. Based on the totality of the offenses, Maxim Krenov is definitively sentenced to life imprisonment, serving the first 7 years of his sentence in prison and the remainder in a special regime correctional colony. But no matter how much investigators saw Maxime as the Danilovsky killer, they failed to convict him for the murders in Cherepovets. Thus, the identity of the Cherepovets killer remains unresolved at the end of April 2025. According to investigators, he has killed more than 14 people. Investigators are currently checking 30,000 individuals, including those already in custody. So far, no matches have been found. Whether the serial killer is still alive or dead also remains a mystery that investigators are trying to solve. The possibilities are diverse. Here, both painstaking work and the re-examination of all case documents considering modern, highly advanced methods and technologies, as well as a stroke of luck, can help. For example, if a similar genome is entered into the database that turns out to be a relative, this would already be a new lead to follow up on. Or witnesses might come forward pointing to an apartment where there are similar traces, drawings of a similar style, or even trophies that the perpetrator took from the crime scenes. The suspected age of the killer is currently between 58 and 78 years old. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourselves.